We're going to continue through our study this morning. We're in the book of Romans, so open up your Bibles to the book of Romans. Paul talks about some kind of heavy stuff this morning in the end of chapter 1, which is what we'll be focusing on. But just kind of like a quick recap, if you guys were here last week, you remember, we focused and stopped on verses 16 and 17. That's where we spent a little bit of our time last week, and those two verses are kind of the key verses in the really the whole book, because it kind of puts into perspective where Paul is going with his argument, with his writing, and what he's trying to explain to this church here in Rome. And then the basic understanding is that salvation is found in the gospel. The whole book of Romans is about salvation. And but this next section, Paul kind of talks about the darkness of our condition, so the darkness of us as sinners. And I kind of want to define a key term as we get started here. How would you guys define wrath? So what is wrath? Wrath is hard to say. Feels like I have a lisp when I say wrath. Wrath. What's wrath? What is that? You guys know what that word is, right? All right, so some type of anger that's taken out in action. Do we typically define wrath as like a good thing, or is it evil or bad or sinful? Like, do we define it? Is it good? Is it neutral? What do you think we normally define wrath as? It can be either. So it's kind of like in the middle, maybe, depending on the situation. So, hypothetically, how would you express your wrath? Purely hypothetical, of course. How would you express your wrath? What would you guys do? What do you think, Clay? What would you do? Okay, yell. No, that's legitimate, I think. What do you think, Ellie? I mean, yelling is definitely one. Emma, what do you think? Like physical, right? Like a physical assault. I'm going to physically assault somebody. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. All of these things are legitimate. See, that's what we think when we think of wrath. We think of violence. We think of vengeance. I'm just going to simply knock somebody out, And this is why we view typically this as sinful. We see wrath as, I'm going to retaliate because of an offense that someone had against me. Like, okay, you offended me, I'm going to now unleash my wrath on you. That's kind of the attitude, I guess, that we can sometimes think. And, we do this because we want to see justice served. Like, we think it's not fair, it's not just, because they've hurt me, they've done something to me, and I'm going to make sure that something happens to them that's equally as punishing or harmful or hurtful, and so we kind of take it in our own hands here. And what we're going to be getting into is just this idea of God's wrath. And so God is not sinful. God is not petty or vindictive, right? So when we talk about God's wrath, it's Him coming justly against some type of sin. That's when God's wrath is poured out. It's not because He got his feelings hurt, and he's going to give his wrath to someone because he made them sad. It made me sad what you did. That's not how God operates. That's a lot of times how we operate. It's not how God operates. And we're going to read about his wrath here this morning. Let's get into verse 18. We're in Romans chapter 1. We read through, we're going to be over the course of this month going through and reading through all of chapters 1 and chapters 2. Okay, so last week we did and read through verse 17. We're going to read the rest of the chapter here starting at verse 18. So let's go ahead and read this together. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. Okay, so here's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying that God's wrath is going to come down on people who recognize that God is there, that God exists, but they choose to ignore him. Okay, and so it's the people that, okay, I know that God is there, I know God's present, but I'm not going to worship him. I'm not going to care about him. I'm not going to focus on him. And we may tend to view that as a very limited amount of people. All right, we kind of picture that as a small group because we interact with people who are not choosing God, but they're willingly and defiantly saying that there is no God. Like, I'm not worshiping God because God doesn't exist. God's not real. And so we may see that this is kind of like a small section of the population. But what really Paul is addressing here, he's addressing anyone who chooses not to follow God. He's not pushing people into this box and saying, as long as you acknowledge God, but if you don't choose to follow God, that's who I'm referring to. That's who God's wrath is going to come on to. No. It's anyone that is not choosing to follow God. And the reason that Paul gives is because he says God has made it clear who he is. God has revealed who he is to all people. So it's up to them whether or not they're willing to acknowledge that God is who he says he is. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to incur or face God's wrath. That's kind of what he's addressing here because, guys, the more that we dig into science, I mean, it's amazing to me how people who study science in depth can still deny God's existence. I mean, the more that you learn about the solar system, the more you learn about the human body and just the migration of atoms, the more you know about nature, the more that there's evidence that screams out to you that there has to be a creator, that there has to be someone who is intelligent to design everything to work together. And so it's kind of baffling to me that anyone would deny that. And it was baffling to Paul too, because Paul is saying here, God has made it clear. The evidence is all around us that God is real, and it's a matter of what you're going to do with God. And if you choose to not follow God, if you choose to ignore what you've heard or what you believe about him, then you're going to face God's wrath. That's what Paul's saying here. Before we continue reading, there's a couple key words, and I want you to kind of notice these as we go through. See, anytime that really, I guess, any writer, but especially if we're focusing on the Bible here, especially any writer in the Bible, if they're repeating a word throughout their writing, they're typically doing that because that word or that concept is important, that they really want to get that message across to you. We as parents do the same thing with our kids. And so you guys may have heard your parents say the same thing over and over and over and over again. So it sticks in your mind. My mom used to tell me the difference between some kind of grammatical statement that I always made, that that was incorrect. And I would say something like, hey, he should have went. Well, that's incorrect. And my mom would always, he should have gone. He should, so it's a different, like a verbiage. But I can remember that. It's like tattooed in my brain because my mom would say it over and over and over again. And I just would just stubbornly say, no, I'm saying it wrong. I don't care. I don't care what you say anymore. I'm saying it wrong, because she would say it to me all the time. It would just frustrate me. But our parents, they say things like that, and they repeat it over and over and over, so it sticks in our mind. Paul is going to use these kind of same words and terms, and there's two phrases that we're going to be kind of focusing on as we go through this passage. It's the phrase "gave them up" and the word "exchanged." All right, so we're going to look at kind of those two terms and what they mean. Actually, he used the word "exchange" in the verse that we just read in verse 23. So kind of just keep those in your mind as we go through and see kind of how Paul is using them. Let's go to verse 24. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So here's what happens when we continue to reject God, okay? It's going to lead us to further spiral down into more depravity and more sin. This is what happens when we choose to reject God, because here's what God does. All right, God sees that behavior, and here's what he does. He lets us. He allows us to navigate our way and spiral down into more depravity and more sin. See, God's not going to demand our allegiance. He's not going to hold you hostage and say that you must serve him and be obedient to him. Here's what he's going to do. He's going to give you over to whatever you desire the most. So whatever is most important to you, God's going to say, okay, you can run with that. You can have that. I'm not going to force you to love me. My desire for your life is that you desire me above all, because I created you, because I have a plan for you. But if you want to desire these other things, then I'm going to just let you run towards it. I'm going to let you have those things. God's going to allow you to do that. Let's finish up verse 28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So here's one of the main points here. The wrong focus is going to lead us to the wrong life. You know, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about our life from like a big picture perspective, right? I mean, we just don't. We don't have the time to do that. We plan out and think about our future that's going over the course of the next few days, few weeks, few months. We think about our future in like little chunks, and sometimes we think about it in big chunks, but very rarely do we think about our life in totality. So from the time that we're born to the time that we die, we don't think about it in that kind of context. But when we think about our life, this thought needs to echo in your mind that guys, this is it. This is the only life that you're ever going to get. I mean, how old are you? 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, whatever age you are. You're that age right now, and you're never going to be that age again. Well, like never. This is it. You get one chance to live your life. And so what are you going to do with that one chance? Do you really want to live and have all of these regrets in your life about things that you wish you had done differently, about choices that you had made that didn't drastically affect your life, that didn't affect and hurt people around you? Guys, this is the only chance that we get, and we have to have, if we really want to live the way God intended us for live, our focus has to be on Him. Let's get back to these words and phrases. I want to dive into this a little bit deeper. So there's kind of three different exchanges that happen, that take place here, and there are then three things that God does as a result of that we're going to call releases. Okay, so the first exchange that happens is this, that they exchanged worshiping God to idolizing creation. And in verse 23, Paul said that they were willing to exchange the glory of God for images that resembled created things. And so, I mean, what does that look like for us? It looks like us choosing, instead of glorifying, uplifting God, to uplift the things that we can experience or have. Like it would be saying that I'm going to choose the glory of the new iPhone instead of the glory of God. I'm gonna choose the glory of obtaining wealth instead of choosing the glory of God. I'm going to choose the glory of love and acceptance from people instead of choosing the glory of God. See, we can be just as guilty as these people here in Rome of abandoning God's glory for things that we see and experience. There's two Psalms up on the board. In Psalm 57, we see God's glory covers the earth. King David wrote in chapter 24 of Psalm that God is the King of glory. I use my iPhone all the time. I do. I mean, it's great. I use it for all kinds of different things. Would be kind of ridiculous for me to call it the King of glory, right? It's not. It's this thing. And yet sometimes we focus on these material things that we have, and in that way, here's what we're doing. We're idolizing that thing or that experience or that person, whatever it is that you guys maybe are thinking about right now that's jumping into your mind. We can so easily put that front and center and exchange what we should be focusing on, God's glory, for this other thing, whatever it is. The second exchange that happens is we exchange a God-given desire for things to things that are unnatural. So in verse 27, we see that what was happening, these people were exchanging natural sexual relations for those that weren't natural. And Paul specifically mentions this issue of homosexuality, but it doesn't rest with that. This is not the only thing that is unnatural. There's a lot of things that exist in life that goes against God's intended design. Anything that differs from how God explains it and describes it is an unnatural expression of His purpose. And we see it a lot in our culture because we see this issue in our culture. I mean, homosexuality is an unnatural expression of sexual relationships. I think that couples who live together when they're not married, I think that is an unnatural expression of a marriage relationship. Abortion is an unnatural expression of the determination of life and death. Even something like gluttony, it's an unnatural expression of a way to nourish your body. Guys, there's lots of things that fall into this mindset of what our culture has kind of embraced, but it's against God's natural design and order for how things were intended. The third exchange is in verse 28. People went and they exchanged this idea of recognizing God to denying God. The word's actually not used in this passage, but the concept is that this is what these people were doing. They didn't see a point in acknowledging God. God's not important enough in my life that I'm willing to even acknowledge that He's there. In other words, I'm living my life so removed from God and His standards that God now has no bearing on my life. God, there's no value that He's added here. He's either not real or valuable. He's just not important enough for me to consider when I'm making decisions, when I'm just simply going through my day. I don't consider or think of God anymore. They went from recognizing Him to denying Him. This is where many people are in our culture. In fact, there's times when we feel like we need to deny the existence of God just to seem like we fit in, or even just to seem like we're intelligent people. Like we can't possibly be intelligent or academic at all if we believe that God exists. And so in theory, okay, well, I'm just going to deny that God exists because I want to fit in and I want to be kind of considered knowledgeable about things in life. And but I think there's an even greater danger in what could also exist and happen in life is where we claim that there is God. We claim that we are worshiping God, and yet there's no evidence of our ability to do that. They say that they believe in God, but in your practical life, you're not doing that at all. Actually reminded me of a commercial that I saw years and years ago, and I found it because it's kind of, I guess, appropriate and fits with what we're talking about here. So let me just go ahead and play this.
Present for you.
Another one for me. Julio. I don't have this one. Thank you. You know what? I think I'm going to go try it on.
Right, so it's very simple. You know, it's what is being presented or perceived in your life. You know, you can talk a lot about the professions that you make. You can talk a lot about what you think and what you believe. But when you push all of that stuff away, what is it that's in the back of your closet? What is it that you are maybe trying to hide or maybe are a little bit embarrassed of? There's a minister who, he died a few years ago now, Brendan Manning. He had a pretty popular quote that said this: the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny Him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. There are a lot of Christians who say that they believe in Jesus, and that's great. I mean, we can make any declaration we want, right? I believe in Jesus. But as they live their life, they're denying Him because they're not living the way that Jesus instructed them to live. I mean, does that describe your life at all? When you think about your life, does that describe your life? Where you say, I'm a Christian, but you're not willing to follow Jesus in what He instructs us to do. You know, so all of these exchanges that take place, this is kind of our role in it. But I really want you to see what God does in response to that. That's why this other phrase comes up: God gave them up. All right, I want you to see what God does when we choose to make these exchanges in our life. There's 3 times that it's mentioned in verse 24, 26, and 28. God simply released people and said, go ahead, pursue what you want to pursue. This is more valuable than me, then go for it. Then go to it. They were given up then to impure hearts. So this is what happens right after someone chooses to shift from a vertical focus on God to the things that they see around them, which we call the horizontal focus. So it's the people, it's the things that are in their life, and what we see is we see God giving them up to then these impure hearts. And really what they did, Paul mentions specifically here, that they ignored one of the greatest gifts that God has given, this bond that exists between husband and wife, and they pursued relationships outside of marriage. And you wonder, okay, why did Paul mention this particular sin? There were obviously other things going on, but Paul zeroes in on this one. And, okay, wonder why. Like why does he focus on this issue? And I think it's because of what the marriage represents. You know, this existence that and gift that God has given between a man and a woman, because when we see the creation of marriage, we see God intended them to come together as one flesh, so that there wouldn't be anything that separated them or broke them up. And we see that there's damage that exists when that happens. When we look at the book of Ephesians, there's a huge section that Paul goes into in this letter to the church at Ephesus about what marriage means and what marriage looks like, and how he compares marriage to, so the relationship that a man has with a woman, to what Christ is like with his church. He has this comparison, and he uses this concept of marriage, and it's because of how it's designed. It's designed to be permanent. It's designed to be one-to-one, one man and woman. That's the design that God had, and that's kind of how he views. He doesn't want anything else coming in between that bond. Secondly, God gave them up to then impure bodies. So the second exchange that we looked at was they exchanged worshiping God for worshiping things that were created. And so from that, Paul said, well, God's going to give you over to even more shameful things that have happening. And Paul described this one in particular, this issue of homosexuality. And, you know, I think what you'll see happening here, and as we think about this even more, what I think God does is I think he allows us to go down and get to the point where we're thinking about things and thinking things are normal that are completely unnatural. I mean, God kind of allows our minds to move in that direction, and as we move further away from his intention for life, we begin doing things that naturally don't make sense. I mean, homosexuality naturally doesn't make sense, right? Proclaiming yourself a god, that doesn't naturally make sense. Thinking that your money makes you important, that doesn't naturally make sense. Thinking that someone is inferior to you because of their race or their gender, that doesn't naturally make sense. See, this is what God's allowing us to move to deeper levels of sin, and we'd start choosing things that are not natural for life. Third, here's what he does. Given up to impure minds. So this last one is that God gives us to be just completely depraved, and you know the unbeliever who has turned from God, they think completely different than God thinks. I mean, and that's hopefully helpful for us to know that people who are removed from God, they live their lives completely foreign to the way God intended life to live. So the point is that if you are not a believer, then you're cut off from the source of life that allows you to live the way God intended you to live. The main point that we're trying to zero in this morning and this evening is that as we think about what it means to stretch our faith, is that we can stretch our faith by starting something new. And so for some of you, maybe you just need a renewed relationship with the Lord. Maybe you've never asked Jesus into your heart, asked to rescue me from sin. God, I'm a sinner. I need you to save me from my sin. Maybe some of you have accepted that at some point in the past, and you just kind of wandered away from that. Now is the time to refocus. Guys, you're never going to be this age again. The decisions that you make today, whether they're small or big, you're never going to get to make them again. You get one chance. Guys, we get one chance at life. Like, how are you choosing to live your life? And I know some of you. I know some of you guys maybe aren't into either of those camps. Maybe you have made a decision to trust in Christ and you have been following him faithfully, or at least semi-faithfully. I'm trying to follow him faithfully. And I get that's where some of you are. And if that's the case, here's what I want to encourage you with. I want you to understand that this life that Paul describes here, this is how people outside live. This is how people are living their life. And so when we, especially now, right, we're in kind of an election cycle, and it's really, it's annoying, it's frustrating, because we hear all these things, and we see people that think differently than us. And haven't you ever gotten to a point where you're like, I don't understand. How can they not see what I see? How can they not see that this is wrong, that this is not, I don't understand how that can happen. Well, Paul is explaining it. This is how it could happen. People that don't care or think about God, they're living their life different than God intended. We need to have this understanding as we see and interact with people, because what you decide about Jesus, it makes all the difference in what you're doing in your life. Even you guys that are sitting there right now, what you decide about who Jesus is, it changes your life. Because if you are constantly and faithfully saying Jesus is God, Jesus is someone that's worth living for, Jesus is someone that's worth dying for, you're going to live your life very differently than someone that's not willing to make those claims consistently. And that's what God is expecting us to do. We also need to be responsible for helping people know and see that this exchange that they want to make in their life, that I'm going to trade knowing God for worshiping other things, and I'm going to make these exchanges in my life, that they're, at the end of the day, that they're not worth it. Guys, we have to be bold and willing to share that with people when we see them making that exchange in their life. Like, I see them, that person is not doing what I know they should be doing. I want to take it upon myself to go correct them, to be bold, to let them know that this is not worth it. This life that you're living, it's too short, and we only got one. It's important that we make good, wise decisions. Let me pray. God, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for speaking to us in your word, and God, continue to challenge us and help us to know what you're calling each one of us to. God, I believe that your Spirit is now just kind of stirring up hearts, God, and I ask that you just continue to allow your message, your truth to be so stirred up in our hearts now that it pushes us and it almost forces us to act because of how real we sense your presence in our life. We're thankful that you do that, God. We're thankful that you choose to continue to speak to us and constantly are willing to guide us back, God. We know that you let us go into what we desire the most, and so help us to consistently desire you above all things. In Jesus' name, amen.